What if you woke up tomorrow and the water was gone? Not just a drought, not just restrictions, gone. No water to drink, no water to grow food, no water to run a city. This isn't a movie plot. This is the trajectory the American West is already on, and the most powerful man in the world knows it. That's why Donald Trump looked north toward Canada and said something that shocked the entire continent. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, Canada should open its rivers to the United States. Canada's response? 2 words: absolutely not. And that moment, that quiet collision between need and sovereignty, may be the most important confrontation of this century. Not over oil, not over trade, not over territory, over water. Let's start with what's happening on the ground. The Colorado River, the same river that carved the Grand Canyon over millions of years, can no longer reach the sea. It simply runs out before it gets there. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has dropped so low that sunken boats and human remains have been found on the lake bed. Farmers in California are being paid to not grow crops just to save water. Cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas are spending billions to recycle every drop they can find. And scientists are not optimistic. They say the warming is accelerating, the snowpack is shrinking, the rivers are retreating. So when Trump stood up and said Canada has millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north, they have essentially a very large faucet, to millions of Americans, that didn't sound crazy, that sounded like a solution. Now here's what Trump may not have fully considered. Canada holds nearly 1/5 of the world's entire freshwater supply. Its lakes look like inland seas. Its rivers run from mountain glaciers to coastlines across an entire continent. Water isn't just a resource in Canada, it is the landscape. It is the national identity. And when the idea of exporting that water southward was raised, Canada didn't hesitate. Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped forward and delivered one of the most direct statements in recent Canadian political history. He said Canada's water is not a commodity. It is a public trust, something that belongs to the land, to the people, and to future generations, not something to be packaged, priced, and piped across a border. That answer closed the door immediately, but it also opened a much larger conversation, one that the entire world needs to hear. Here's where it gets deeper than politics. Carney's argument wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. He warned that the moment a country begins treating its water as an exportable product, it starts losing control of that water forever. Trade agreements kick in, corporate contracts are signed, international law gets involved, and what was once a sovereign resource, something a government could protect for its own people, becomes subject to the rules of the global market. Think about oil. Once the pipelines were built, once the contracts were signed, once the industry took root, there was no going back. The economic momentum became unstoppable. This standoff between the United States and Canada is not an isolated incident. It is a preview. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, nations are already fighting, sometimes literally, over access to rivers and aquifers. The term water wars, once dismissed as science fiction, is now appearing in government security documents around the world. Analysts are increasingly clear. In the coming decades, water will replace oil as the world's most contested resource. The countries that control fresh water will hold a kind of power that has no parallel. And in that world, Canada sits on a staggering advantage. Rather than selling its water, Canada's been doing something different. Ottawa's been investing billions in conservation programs, ecosystem restoration, and clean energy infrastructure. The strategy isn't about hoarding, it's about stewardship. Carney talks about leaving resources in better condition than you inherited them. He describes water not as an asset to be liquidated, but as a responsibility to be protected. And he's made the stakes explicit. Within 1 generation of opening freshwater trade, Canada could lose control of its own lakes and rivers entirely. The contracts would bind the government's hands. The market would take over. What was once a public trust would become an international commodity. That outcome, he argues, is not a trade deal. It's a surrender. Here is where we are. The United States is drying out, and the pressure to find solutions will only grow. Canada is sitting on reserves that the world will increasingly want, and the 2 closest allies in the world are now staring at each other across a line that has never been this clearly drawn. This is not just a North American story. It is the opening chapter of something global, a shift in the balance of power from those who control energy to those who control water. The decisions made in the next decade will determine whether water remains a human right or becomes a privilege for those who can afford it, whether it stays a public trust or becomes a product, and whether nations like Canada, who were given abundance by geography, choose to guard it or give it away. The water wars aren't coming, they've already begun. Carney is saying do not let that happen with water, because water is not like oil. You can find alternatives to oil, you cannot find an alternative to water. And if a nation loses control of its water supply, it doesn't just lose an industry, it loses the ability to provide for its own people. That is the definition of lost sovereignty. But there's another layer to this, and it may be even more alarming. Canada's ecosystems are already under stress. Glaciers are retreating, rainfall patterns are shifting, wildlife habitats are being disrupted by rising temperatures. If Canada were to begin diverting fresh water southward at scale through massive pipeline networks, the damage to its river systems, its fish populations, its wetlands, and its ecological balance could be irreversible. We're not talking about a temporary inconvenience. We're talking about permanently altering river systems that have existed for thousands of years. Once you drain a watershed, you don't simply refill it. Carney framed it this way: the short-term economic gain would be paid for by the long-term collapse of natural stability, and that's a price no amount of money can justify. Now, to be fair, not everyone sees it this way. From the American side, especially among Trump supporters and certain Washington policy groups, this looks straightforward. To them, this is straightforward economics. Canada has a surplus, America has a deficit. Why not trade? Some policy groups have already begun drawing up proposals for intercontinental water pipelines, infrastructure projects that would carry Canadian river water all the way to the American Southwest. They call it cooperative flow. They argue both countries benefit. Canada earns revenue, America solves its crisis. And you can understand the logic. When millions of people are facing water shortages, moral arguments about sovereignty can feel abstract. Survival tends to override philosophy. But here's the problem with that thinking, and it's the same problem Canada has identified. Once survival becomes the argument, negotiations stop being negotiations. They become demands.
And here is what keeps experts up at night. America is not the only country that will come asking. China is already facing severe water shortages across its northern plains. India and Pakistan share rivers that are shrinking every year, and those two nations have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. The Middle East has been managing water scarcity for decades, and the situation is getting worse, not better. When the world's most powerful economies start running dry, they don't politely accept the shortage. They look outward, they build leverage, they use trade deals, military alliances, and economic pressure to secure what they need. Canada understands this, which is why this moment, this standoff with its closest ally and most powerful neighbor, is being treated not as a diplomatic disagreement, but as a rehearsal, a test of whether Canada can hold its line when the pressure is friendly. Because if it cannot hold the line against Washington, it will certainly not hold it against the rest of the world when they come knocking. Mark Carney has said it plainly: protecting water is not environmental policy, it is national security. And in a world that is heating up, drying out, and growing more desperate by the decade, that security will be tested again and again. The question is not whether Canada's water will be wanted. The question is whether Canada will have the strength to keep saying no.